Mr. Collins stood in the grand, marble-floored lobby of his towering corporate headquarters, his tall figure casting a commanding shadow over everyone present. Known for his ruthless demeanor and ironclad authority, he ruled his company with a cold efficiency that left no room for empathy or compassion. To him, success was measured in numbers, power, and prestige. Anyone beneath his rank was simply a tool to achieve his goals, especially those like Jane. Jane was a quiet, hard-working cleaner who had worked in the company for years. She had never drawn attention to herself, always arriving early, staying late, and performing her duties with quiet dedication. But today, a small mistake had caught Mr. Collins's eye. As he walked through the lobby, he spotted a small smudge on the glass of the front door, a streak that should have been wiped away. His eyes narrowed as his temper flared. "Jane!" His sharp voice rang out, echoing in the spacious lobby. Several employees glanced up from their desks, sensing the brewing storm. Jane, who had been quietly cleaning near the reception area, froze. Her heart began to race, and her hands instinctively tightened around the mop she was holding. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the room growing tense as Mr. Collins stormed towards her. "How long have you worked here, Jane?" he demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. His words cut through the air like a knife, sending a wave of dread through her. Jane lifted her head slightly, her face pale. "6 years, sir," she replied quietly, her voice barely audible. "6 years," he repeated, his tone mocking. 6 years of doing this simple job, and you still can't manage to clean a door properly? He gestured towards the barely visible smudge on the glass, as though it were an egregious offense. Jane lowered her gaze, the weight of his words crushing her spirit. Her cheeks flushed with shame as she stood before him, powerless to defend herself. She had worked so hard to provide for her family, to keep her job, yet here she was, being berated in front of everyone for a mistake so small it seemed insignificant. But to Mr. Collins, it was a matter of principle, his principle of perfectionism, regardless of who suffered under its weight. "I pay you to clean, and you can't even do that right," he continued, his voice rising. "Just a cleaner, and yet you think you can get away with half-hearted work? Pathetic." His words hit her like blows, each one striking deeper than the last. Jane's hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Her co-workers remained silent, some avoiding eye contact, others glancing at her with pity, but not daring to speak up. In Mr. Collins's world, challenging him meant risking your livelihood, and none of them could afford that. As the humiliation stretched on, the air in the room grew heavier. Mr. Collins' rant seemed endless, his voice filling every corner of the lobby. Jane felt herself shrinking under the weight of his anger, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She wanted to disappear, to flee, but she stood rooted to the spot, trapped by her sense of duty and fear of losing her job. "And to think," Mr. Collins spat, "that someone like you should be thankful for even having a job here. I could replace you with anyone off the street. You should remember your place, just a cleaner." Those words cut deeper than all the others. Just a cleaner. As though her work, her efforts, her life meant nothing. As though her worth could be boiled down to the title of her job and nothing more. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let him see her cry. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. She stood there, silently enduring his tirade, her hands clenched around the mop as her body trembled. Her heart ached, not just from the cruelty of his words, but from the realization that, in his eyes, she was invisible, unimportant, less than human. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Collins stopped. His cold eyes scanned the room one last time before he turned and walked away, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The employees, who had witnessed the entire scene, returned to their work without a word, their faces drawn with discomfort and unease. No one dared to approach Jane, not even to offer a word of comfort. Jane stood there for a few moments longer, her chest tight with the weight of the humiliation. Slowly, she exhaled and wiped her eyes, forcing herself to move, to continue her work as though nothing had happened. But inside, the hurt festered. She had always known that Mr. Collins saw people like her as beneath him, but today had proven just how deep his disdain ran. As Jane resumed cleaning, her movements mechanical and hollow, the words, "just a cleaner," echoed in her mind, over and over again. She had always taken pride in her work, however menial it seemed to others, but today that pride had been shattered. And as she worked in silence, her heart heavy with the pain of the humiliation she had just endured, one thing became clear. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave, she would always be just a cleaner to men like Mr. Collins. A week had passed since Mr. Collins publicly humiliated Jane, but the incident clung to his thoughts like a shadow. At first, he had brushed it off, believing his actions were justified. After all, he ran a multi-million-dollar company and expected nothing less than perfection from his employees. If someone failed in their duties, it was his job to correct them. Or so he told himself. But as the days wore on, the image of Jane's downcast face, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, refused to leave him. Sitting at his large oak desk in his corner office, overlooking the bustling city from the towering windows, Mr. Collins tried to focus on his work. Reports, spreadsheets, meetings, and financial statements lay scattered before him, but his concentration faltered. Every time he glanced down at a piece of paper or tried to type an email, his mind wandered back to that moment in the lobby. He could still hear the echo of his own voice, harsh and unrelenting, as he belittled her in front of the entire office. "Just a cleaner," he had said, the words now echoing in his mind with a different weight. At the time, it had felt like a justified reprimand, but now, in the quiet of his office, it felt like something far worse, an abuse of power, a lashing out at someone who didn't deserve it. The memory gnawed at him. Jane's silent endurance, the way she stood there, head bowed, accepting his verbal blows without a word of protest. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully explain. She hadn't fought back, hadn't tried to defend herself. It was almost as if she had expected to be treated that way. The thought made him uncomfortable. He tried to shake off the guilt, telling himself that Jane was just another employee, that she was used to hard work and reprimands. But no matter how many times he told himself this, the guilt lingered. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing there, vulnerable and humiliated, while he towered over her with his cutting words. By the end of the week, the guilt had grown too large to ignore. His work no longer served as a distraction, and his usual confidence had been replaced by an unsettling feeling he couldn't quite name. His nights were restless, his sleep plagued with dreams of Jane's sorrowful expression. It was as though her silent suffering had imprinted itself onto his conscience, refusing to let go. And then, one evening, as he sat alone in his office, long after everyone else had gone home, a thought crept into his mind. What if he had been wrong about her? What if there was more to Jane's story than he had ever considered? He had been so quick to judge her, to assume that her life as a cleaner was one of mediocrity and failure. But what if, in his arrogance, he had missed something important? What if there was a reason for her quiet dignity, a reason she had endured his cruelty without protest? Curiosity began to stir within him. He found himself wondering what her life was like outside of work. Did she have a family? Was she struggling with more than just the menial tasks of cleaning? The thought intrigued him and gnawed at his conscience even more. He needed to know more about Jane, to understand who she really was. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had misjudged her, and the only way to put his guilt to rest was to find out the truth. The next day, Mr. Collins made a decision that surprised even himself. After work, instead of heading home to his luxurious penthouse, he discreetly followed Jane. He stayed far enough behind so she wouldn't notice him, but close enough to see where she was going. At first, He felt a twinge of guilt for invading her privacy, but his curiosity overpowered his reservations. He needed to know more about her life, if only to put his own mind at ease. As he followed her through the crowded streets, he noticed the stark differences in their worlds. Jane, in her modest clothes and worn-out shoes, blended in with the people around her, people who were clearly working class, just trying to make ends meet. Mr. Collins, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, felt out of place in this part of the city, like a visitor from a world of privilege that didn't belong here. Jane boarded a bus, and Mr. Collins quickly hailed a taxi to follow her. The ride took them to a poorer side of town, far from the towering office buildings and upscale restaurants that defined Mr. Collins's daily life. The streets were narrower here, the buildings older and more run down. The sidewalks were cracked, and the streetlights flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the worn pavement. Mr. Collins watched as Jane got off the bus and made her way down a narrow alleyway, her steps slow and deliberate. He instructed the taxi driver to stop at the corner, not wanting to follow too closely. From the shadows, he observed her as she approached a small, dilapidated apartment building. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the windows were grimy with age. It was a far cry from the luxurious penthouse Mr. Collins called home. Jane disappeared into the building, and Mr. Collins sat in his taxi for a moment, staring at the worn facade. His mind raced with questions. How could someone endure such hardship with the kind of quiet grace Jane had shown? How could someone who lived in such conditions still come to work every day, still perform her duties without complaint? For the first time in a long while, Mr. Collins felt something unfamiliar, a sense of humility. He had always prided himself on his success, his wealth, and his power, but seeing Jane's reality made him question everything. She lived in a world so different from his own, a world where every day was a struggle, yet she faced it with a strength he had never understood. That night, as Mr. Collins returned to his penthouse, the guilt weighed heavier on him than ever before. He couldn't shake the image of Jane walking into that rundown apartment, her shoulders hunched under the weight of a life far harder than anything he had ever experienced. For the first time, he began to understand just how out of touch he was with the people who worked for him, with the struggles they faced. And as he lay in his expensive bed, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth, Mr. Collins knew one thing for certain. He owed Jane more than just an apology. The following evening, Mr. Collins found himself in the same taxi, following Jane once again. He had spent the entire day at work in a fog, unable to concentrate on anything but the sight of Jane entering that dilapidated apartment the night before. He told himself he was merely curious, that he wanted to understand her life better, perhaps to ease his conscience. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something inside him had shifted. The callousness with which he had treated her now felt like a heavy burden he couldn't shake. He needed to see more, to understand who Jane truly was beyond the cleaner label he had so carelessly slapped on her. As he followed her again that night, the streets became increasingly unfamiliar. The buildings grew more run down, the sidewalks littered with trash, and the flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows over the desolate roads. The affluence of the city seemed to fade away into a distant memory, replaced by a gritty reality Mr. Collins had never encountered. He had spent his life in the lap of luxury, insulated from the harshness of the world. But here, in this part of town, everything was different. It was a place where people worked to survive, where every day was a struggle, and where hope seemed scarce. He watched from a distance as Jane approached the same apartment building. She moved with a certain weariness, her shoulders slumped and her steps slow. Her clothes, though clean, were visibly worn, her coat fraying at the edges, her shoes scuffed and faded. There was no pride in the way she carried herself, only quiet resignation. It struck Mr. Collins that this wasn't a temporary situation for her. This was her life, her everyday reality, and he had belittled her for it. Jane disappeared into the building, and Mr. Collins sat back in the taxi, conflicted. He debated with himself for a few moments, wondering if he should just leave, return to his world of comfort, and forget all of this. But the pull to understand more about her was too strong. He couldn't leave. He needed to see the full picture of Jane's life, to grasp what he had so arrogantly dismissed. Making a quick decision, Mr. Collins got out of the taxi and cautiously approached the apartment building. He stayed in the shadows, moving slowly and quietly. The building was even worse up close. The paint was peeling off in large chunks, exposing the rotting wood underneath. The smell of dampness and mildew clung to the air, mixing with the faint odor of trash from the alley nearby. He cringed at the thought of someone living here. It wasn't fit for anyone, let alone someone like Jane, who had shown nothing but quiet grace despite her circumstances. Through the cracked windows, he caught glimpses of life inside the building. Flickering televisions, dimly lit rooms with sparse furniture, and the tired faces of people who had seen too much hardship. But it was Jane's apartment that caught his attention. From his vantage point, Mr. Collins could see into her small, shabby living room. The furniture was old and mismatched, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. There was a single lamp in the corner, casting a soft, dim light over the room. He watched as Jane moved around inside, setting down her bag and slipping out of her coat. She moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the space. Then, Mr. Collins noticed something that made his heart clench. In the corner of the room, lying on a worn-out sofa, was an elderly woman, Jane's mother. Her face was pale, her frail body wrapped in blankets. Even from a distance, it was clear that she was unwell. Jane moved over to her, kneeling beside the sofa to check on her mother, her face softening with concern. She spoke quietly to her, offering a comforting smile, though her own exhaustion was apparent. Mr. Collins could see the toll it was taking on her, the long hours of work, the care of her sick mother, the weight of responsibility that seemed too much for one person to bear. He felt a pang of guilt so strong that it nearly made him turn away. How had he not seen this before? How had he been so blind to her struggles? He had judged her based on the surface of her life, assuming that her job defined her worth. But here, watching her care for her mother in that shabby apartment, he realized how wrong he had been. Jane was not just a cleaner. She was a daughter, a caregiver, a person with far more strength and resilience than he could ever have imagined. As night fell, Mr. Collins continued to watch, unable to tear himself away. After spending some time with her mother, Jane prepared a simple dinner, something meager, but enough to sustain them for the night. She served her mother first, carefully helping her sit up and feeding her spoonfuls of soup with the same gentle care she had shown at work, never once complaining about the hardship of her life. It was clear that her mother's well-being meant everything to her, and she carried the burden of that responsibility with quiet dignity. Later, after her mother had fallen asleep, Jane cleaned up the small kitchen, putting away the few dishes they had. Then, she checked her watch and let out a weary sigh. Mr. Collins watched as she slipped back into her coat, her face now etched with the weight of another long night ahead. She grabbed her bag and left the apartment once more, heading out into the cold night. Mr. Collins followed at a distance, his heart heavy as he realized where she was going. It wasn't enough that she spent her days cleaning the office. Jane also worked a second job at night, just to make ends meet. He trailed her to a small diner on the outskirts of town, where she changed into a waitress uniform and began her shift. The diner was shabby, the kind of place that didn't see many customers, but Jane worked with the same quiet grace she had shown in the office. As she served tables and took orders, Mr. Collins couldn't help but notice the kindness she extended to everyone she encountered. Despite her own hardships, she smiled at the customers, treated them with respect, and never let her exhaustion show. And then, something remarkable happened. As Jane was leaving the diner late that night, she crossed paths with a homeless man sitting outside. Instead of walking past him, as so many others had done, Jane paused. She reached into her apron and pulled out a few crumpled bills, her hard-earned tips from the night. Without hesitation, she handed the money to the man, offering him a kind word and a smile before heading off into the darkness. Mr. Collins stood frozen in place, watching the exchange with a growing sense of shame. Here was a woman who had so little, who worked tirelessly to care for her sick mother and barely scraped by, yet she still found it within herself to help others. And what had he done? He had mocked her, belittled her, and judged her without ever knowing the truth of her life. That simple act of kindness broke something inside him. For the first time, he truly saw Jane, not as a cleaner, but as a person with far more dignity, strength, and compassion than he had ever known. The next day dawned gray and overcast, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the weight Mr. Collins had been carrying on his shoulders for the past week. He stood at his office window, staring out at the city skyline, his mind racing with thoughts of Jane. He could no longer avoid the truth. The guilt that had slowly eaten away at him had become unbearable. Every image of her struggling life, her small, shabby apartment, her sick mother, the long hours at the diner, and her act of kindness toward the homeless man, played over and over in his mind, haunting him. His once pristine view of himself, the image of the successful businessman who had built an empire, had been shattered. What kind of man belittled someone as resilient and kind as Jane? How could he have been so blind, so heartless? The realization had come too late, but he knew he had to make amends. He couldn't undo the hurtful words he had spoken, but he could try to apologize. And maybe, just maybe, he could find some way to help her. Mr. Collins paced back and forth in his office, his nerves getting the better of him. Apologies were foreign to him. He was a man used to being in control, issuing orders, and never having to admit he was wrong. But this was different. This wasn't about business. This was about righting a personal wrong. He had to face Jane, and he had to do it with humility. No excuses, no justifications, just an apology. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his tie and made his way down to the office where Jane would be cleaning, his heart pounding in his chest. The usually confident Mr. Collins felt his hands trembling slightly. He had no idea how Jane would react. Would she accept his apology, or would she rightfully reject it? He didn't know, but he had to try. As he walked into the area where Jane was working, he saw her quietly moving through the rows of desks, dusting surfaces and wiping down computer screens. Her posture was calm and focused, as if the job was second nature to her. She hadn't noticed him yet, which gave him a moment to observe her. There was something about the way she carried herself that struck him. The quiet grace, the steady determination. She was not a woman beaten down by her circumstances, though her life was hard. She was resilient, pushing forward without complaint, even when life offered her little in return. Finally, mustering all the courage he had, Mr. Collins cleared his throat. Jane turned, her eyes widening slightly in surprise when she saw him standing there. She immediately straightened, her professional demeanor taking over as she waited for him to speak. "Jane," Mr. Collins began, his voice lower than usual. He paused, unsure of how to start. I wanted to talk to you." Jane nodded politely, her expression neutral but curious. She wasn't used to being addressed by someone as high-ranking as Mr. Collins, much less in such a personal way. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "For the way I treated you last week, for the things I said. I was cruel and thoughtless, and I've come to realize that I was completely wrong about you." Jane blinked, clearly not expecting this. She remained silent, giving him space to continue. Mr. Collins took a deep breath. "I judged you unfairly. I looked down on you because of your job, and I said things I never should have. But I've seen now how wrong I was. I've seen how hard you work, how much you do for your mother, and how strong you are despite everything. I can't undo the things I said, but I want you to know that I deeply regret them." Jane's eyes softened, though her face remained composed. She studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words, trying to gauge his sincerity. Mr. Collins fidgeted under her gaze, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Collins, life has never been easy for me. I've learned to expect people to look down on me because of what I do for a living. It's not the first time someone's treated me like that, and it probably won't be the last. But I appreciate your apology." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The fact that she had endured such treatment before, that she had come to expect it, made him feel even worse. She had accepted her lot in life with more dignity than he ever could have imagined. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Mr. Collins admitted, his voice almost breaking. "But I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Jane looked down for a moment, as if contemplating something. When she looked back up, her eyes held a warmth that surprised him. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," she said softly. "It's about letting go of the hurt and moving forward. I've learned that holding on to anger only makes things harder. So yes, I forgive you." Mr. Collins stood there, stunned. Her words, spoken with such grace and wisdom, moved him in a way he hadn't expected. He had come here bracing himself for rejection, but instead, he was met with a kindness that shook him to his core. "Thank you," he whispered, barely able to speak past the lump in his throat. Jane smiled faintly, but there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at seeing the mighty Mr. Collins humbled before her. She simply nodded and turned back to her work, as if the moment was already behind her. But for Mr. Collins, it wasn't. He stood there for a few moments longer, watching her, realizing just how deeply she had impacted him. He had expected to feel relief after apologizing, but what he felt instead was something much deeper, a sense of shame for how he had lived his life up until now. Jane, with her modest job and difficult circumstances, had shown him more strength and dignity than he had ever seen in the high-powered business world he had dominated. He left the office that day, his mind racing. The apology was only the first step. He knew that now. He had to do more. He couldn't just walk away from this and pretend everything was fine. Jane's forgiveness was a gift, but it also came with a responsibility. He had the power to change her life, to make things easier for her, and he was determined to do it. As Mr. Collins walked through the city streets, his thoughts swirled. He wasn't the same man he had been a week ago. Jane had shown him a different way of living, one that wasn't based on wealth, power, or status, but on compassion, kindness, and humility. He had a lot to learn, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to admit that. The morning after his apology to Jane, Mr. Collins sat in his spacious office, staring at the documents piled on his desk. The luxurious surroundings, the polished wood furniture, and the expensive artwork that once symbolized his success now seemed hollow. No matter how much wealth he had accumulated, the gnawing feeling that he had lived his life wrong remained. He had spent so many years looking down on others, equating success with material wealth, that he had missed the simple human connections that gave life its true meaning. Jane's forgiveness had stirred something inside him, something deeper than guilt. It was the realization that he had the power to make a difference, not just by writing checks or making grand gestures, but by being genuinely kind and compassionate. He thought back to the previous week, when he had humiliated her without a second thought, and how she had endured it with quiet strength. She had every right to walk away from him after the apology, but instead, she had chosen to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because that was the kind of person she was. And that realization made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. Determined to do more than just apologize, Mr. Collins knew he had to help Jane in a meaningful way. But it wasn't about charity. It was about giving her the opportunities she deserved. The idea had been simmering in his mind ever since he'd followed her to the poor side of town, watching her struggle to care for her sick mother and work 2 jobs just to survive. He couldn't erase the past, but he could give her a future. That afternoon, he called in a few favors, and arranged for a private care nurse to visit Jane's mother regularly. It wasn't just about providing medical care. It was about easing Jane's burden so she could focus on building a better life for herself. Next, he spoke to his HR department and had them create a position for Jane that suited her skills, a job that would pay far more than her current role as a cleaner, while allowing her the flexibility to continue taking care of her mother. It was a small step, but one that he hoped would help her regain control of her life. When everything was in place, Mr. Collins summoned the courage to approach Jane again. He found her in the office late in the evening, once again cleaning after the rest of the staff had gone home. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the otherwise silent office as she wiped down the desks, her movements steady and practiced. For a moment, Mr. Collins simply watched her, reflecting on how much of her life she had likely spent in the shadows, unnoticed by people like him. "Jane," he called softly as he walked toward her. She turned, surprised to see him again. "Mr. Collins," she acknowledged politely, though her expression was a little wary. She wasn't sure what to expect from him this time. "I've been thinking," he began, running a hand through his hair as he tried to gather his thoughts. "After everything, I want to do more than just apologize. I want to help you, really help you." Jane's brow furrowed, and she put down the rag she had been holding. "Help me?" she asked, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Yes," Mr. Collins said, his voice firmer now. "I've arranged for a private nurse to take care of your mother. You won't have to worry about her not getting the care she needs anymore." Jane's eyes widened, shock and gratitude flashing across her face, but also a hint of caution. "Mr. Collins, that's very kind of you, but—" He held up his hand, stopping her. "I'm not done. I've also spoken to HR, and they're creating a new position for you. It's a better job, with higher pay, and you'll have more time to be with your mother. You deserve more than what this cleaning job offers, Jane. You've worked so hard, and it's time someone recognized that." For a long moment, Jane was silent, processing his words. She had spent so many years struggling, taking on the weight of her responsibilities alone, that the idea of someone stepping in to help felt foreign. Her initial instinct was to refuse, to hold on to her independence and not let anyone think she needed a handout. But this wasn't charity. She saw that now. This was Mr. Collins trying to make amends, trying to right a wrong, not just for her, but for himself as well. "I don't know what to say," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to seem ungrateful, but I'm not used to accepting help." "I understand," Mr. Collins said softly, stepping closer but still giving her space. "But you've earned this, Jane. It's not a gift or a favor. It's what you deserve. Let me do this for you." Tears welled up in Jane's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, not wanting to cry in front of him. She had spent her life being strong, never showing vulnerability, but in that moment, she realized how tired she was, how exhausted she had been from carrying so many burdens on her own. Slowly, she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for this, but for understanding." Mr. Collins exhaled, relief washing over him. He had half expected her to refuse, to tell him she didn't need his help, but the fact that she had accepted it felt like a small victory. And yet, it wasn't about him anymore. This was about giving her the chance she deserved. Over the next few weeks, the changes in both their lives were profound. Jane settled into her new role with the grace and diligence that had always defined her work. The extra income allowed her to move her mother into a better living situation, and the weight of her financial worries began to lift. More importantly, she no longer had to stretch herself thin between two jobs, which meant she could finally breathe again. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, found that the simple act of helping someone without expecting anything in return had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to view his employees differently, no longer seeing them as mere cogs in the machine, but as individuals with their own struggles, dreams, and hardships. His once hardened outlook on life softened as he realized that compassion and empathy were far more valuable than the wealth he had spent his life chasing. One evening, as Mr. Collins sat in his office, long after the workday had ended, he reflected on how much had changed. The company was still thriving, but the way he ran it had shifted. He had implemented policies to ensure that every employee was treated with respect, regardless of their position. He had also started a scholarship fund to help employees' families, inspired by Jane's resilience and determination to provide a better life for her mother. But the biggest change had been within himself. For the first time in his life, Mr. Collins felt fulfilled, not because of the money he had made or the deals he had closed, but because he had learned the true value of human connection. Jane had taught him that wealth wasn't the measure of a person's worth. Character was. And in that lesson, he had found something far more precious than any fortune. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.